The moment my dad spoke, the room seemed to shrink. "You can take the guest room," he said, his voice calm, almost casual, like he was offering me a glass of water. Then he glanced at my mom and added, "Or you can move out." That's it. No hesitation, no softness, just words dropped like stones onto a table I had once thought of as mine. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. The dinner table looked the same as always, worn edges, scratches from childhood homework, and faint stains from birthday cake icing. But everything about it felt foreign now. This table, which had once held laughter and family celebrations, now seemed like a judgment hall. My mom didn't meet my eyes. She focused on her plate, carefully slicing her chicken into impossibly neat pieces, as if pretending I wasn't there would make this conversation disappear. My sister, seated across from me, gave me a small, polite smile, like she had been briefed to stay neutral. I could feel the tension in the air pressing down on my chest. Guest room. That word echoed. The room meant for visitors who didn't belong, people who passed through and then left. And now apparently it was meant for me. I was 24, back home temporarily after a year that had knocked me off my feet, laid off, exhausted, questioning everything about my career and myself. They had said I could stay until I got back on track. I thought things were fine. Clearly I had been wrong. I don't understand, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've been staying in my room. My old room. Finally, my mom looked up. Her expression was tight, closed off. "That room isn't yours anymore," she said flatly. "Your sister needs it when she visits. And honestly, it's time you stop thinking you can stay forever." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Stop thinking I could stay forever? I had worked 2 jobs, paid them rent, bought my own groceries, stayed out of everyone's way. I didn't have parties, I didn't invite friends over. I cleaned up, I stayed quiet. None of it mattered. I glanced at my dad, who had started clearing his throat, ready to punctuate the statement with his usual finality. "You're not a kid anymore. Adults don't live with their parents." I wanted to laugh at the irony. My sister was 30 and had a key to the house. She showed up whenever she wanted, borrowed money, and left chaos in her wake. And yet somehow I was the one being punished for existing in the space I grew up in. I looked around at the familiar dining room. The chipped plates, the scent of roasted chicken and herbs, the light filtering in through curtains I had once drawn back as a child, and felt a mix of disbelief and quiet rage. Their ultimatum had nothing to do with practicality. It was a statement about where I belonged in their minds. "So," I said slowly, my voice measured, "those are my options? Guest room or leave?" Mom nodded, her face unreadable. "We're just being honest," she said. Honest. That word stung. Honesty implied fairness. But this felt like a declaration that the decision had already been made long before I even sat down for dinner. I pushed back my chair, hands trembling slightly, but my voice stayed steady. "When do you want me out?" Dad hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "A few days," he said finally. "Enough time to pack your things." I nodded, calmly, slowly, like this was normal. Like this wasn't the moment they were quietly telling me I didn't belong. I got up, walked upstairs, and closed my door behind me. The walls, once familiar, now felt like barriers. I sat on the bed, staring at the room that used to be mine, feeling an unfamiliar clarity creeping in. They thought those were my only options, guest room or move out. But they didn't know me well enough to predict what I would choose. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house sounded like a countdown. Guest room, move out, guest room, move out. And as the hours passed, I realized something. The guest room wasn't a choice, it was a statement, a declaration that I was temporary, tolerated, not truly welcome. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to take the guest room. I wasn't going to compromise with a space that represented conditional acceptance. I would leave. Not angrily, not dramatically, but decisively, on my own terms. I woke before anyone else the next morning, the house still wrapped in silence, the light sneaking through the blinds, painted stripes across my face, and I realized I felt lighter, strange but real, lighter than I had felt in months. The ultimatum hung in the air, but the weight on my chest had shifted. It wasn't fear that woke me. It was clarity. I went straight to the kitchen, my bare feet whispering against the hardwood floor. I brewed a pot of coffee, the rich smell filling the room like a promise of a new day. I didn't just make coffee for comfort. I needed a ritual, a marker, something to remind me I was choosing myself today. Every movement, from pouring water to stirring the sugar, felt intentional. Small acts of control in a house that had always dictated my life. The kitchen felt too quiet. That quiet had always been my enemy, a reminder of how invisible I could be under the guise of being helpful. I wiped the counter slowly, as if marking time, rehearsing the steps I would take in the coming hours. My mom entered just as I was drying the last plate. She didn't look at me, just spoke over the hum of the coffee maker. "So have you thought about it?" she asked, her voice low, clipped, almost like she was testing me. I nodded without hesitation. "Yes," I said. My voice was calm, measured, steady. She paused, visibly surprised, but didn't comment. A tension lingered in the room, something that had never existed before. A small acknowledgement that I had made a choice they hadn't anticipated. "You're sure?" she asked, finally looking at me. I met her eyes this time. "I'm moving out," I said. Flat, simple, unshaken. The words carried no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet certainty. Her mouth opened slightly, and I could see the confusion, the disbelief forming across her features. "Wait, what? You don't want the guest room?" I shook my head. "It's not a compromise. I don't need a room that's offered like a favor, with a side of judgment. I'll take my life elsewhere." She froze, the words hitting her in waves. I had expected resistance, maybe tears, maybe an argument. But nothing came. Just that frozen pause, the sort of quiet that comes when someone realizes they miscalculated. Dad appeared then, coffee mug in hand, rubbing his eyes like he hadn't slept. He watched the interaction, quietly, his expression unreadable. My mom tried to explain, adding her usual qualifiers. I was being sensitive, overthinking, misunderstanding their intentions. But her words didn't land with me. I was done hearing excuses. Where will you go?" my dad finally asked, voice cautious. "I don't fully know yet," I said honestly, "but I'll figure it out. I always do." There was a pause, a long, tense pause. He looked at my mom, unsure, waiting for guidance. They had never seen me like this. Calm, collected, refusing to accept their version of care and convenience. I began packing mid-morning. Not loudly, not dramatically. I slid my clothes into boxes carefully, folding the items I didn't even think I'd miss. Books went into tote bags, old journals stacked neatly. I avoided sentimental items that tied me to the house, photos, childhood trinkets, trophies. Those things belonged in the past, in the memory of what once was, not in the life I was claiming now. Every so often, I'd catch my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me seemed older, stronger, a little wearier, perhaps, but undeniably steady. This was no longer a girl waiting for approval. This was a woman asserting herself. And every step of the packing reinforced that. By afternoon, the boxes began to fill the room, neat stacks standing like markers of autonomy. The guest room remained untouched, silent, empty, waiting. It called to me like a trap dressed as an offer, a reminder that staying meant toleration. I wouldn't take it. Later, my mom returned to the room, leaning against the doorframe. "Most people would be grateful," she said, voice tight, almost resentful, "that we're letting you stay." I looked at her carefully, really looked this time. Grateful for what? I asked softly. Being tolerated? Being given a space, as though I'm a visitor in my own home? Her eyes flickered, but she didn't answer. I realized something then. They had been offering comfort without care, help without warmth, space without belonging, and I didn't need it. That night, I lay on the floor, surrounded by boxes, feeling the strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the quiet echoes of my dad's words. Guest room, move out, guest room, move out. But for the first time, the fear was gone. It had been replaced with resolve. By morning, I made my final preparations. Car packed, essentials ready, keys in hand. I paused at the door, looking back at the room that had once been mine, at the walls that had grown foreign. And then I left. No shouting, no confrontation, just steps toward a life that felt like mine. The drive away from my childhood home was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no last-minute pleadings. Just the hum of tires against asphalt and the occasional chirp of a bird. The house faded in the rearview mirror, shrinking with every mile, but the weight it carried, the expectations, the judgments, the silent rules, didn't vanish so easily. It lingered like a ghost whispering, "You're leaving because you don't belong." I arrived at my new place in the early afternoon. A tiny studio apartment tucked above a quiet street. Bare walls, a small kitchenette, a mattress on the floor. It wasn't much. It wasn't glamorous. But it was mine. And for the first time in months, maybe years, it felt like that was enough. I stepped inside slowly, letting the door click shut behind me, and exhaled a long, deep breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The room smelled faintly of paint and dust, but that too felt like a kind of promise. Fresh start, clean slate, blank pages. I set my bags down, arranged them neatly in the corner, and walked around slowly, letting my hands brush over the cold countertop, the smooth wooden floors, the windowsills that caught the sunlight. Every touch was an assertion. I belonged here. I didn't call my parents immediately, even though I knew they'd be expecting a phone call. I wanted silence. I needed it. Silence to sit with myself, to feel the weight of my independence, and to notice something that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The air felt lighter. The space felt larger. And in that emptiness, I realized just how much energy I had spent trying to prove I belonged in someone else's home. Here, I didn't need to prove anything. Unpacking was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Clothes folded, books stacked, kitchen items arranged neatly. I even put a small potted plant near the window, something living to remind me that growth was possible, even in the smallest spaces. Each box I unpacked felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't known was lost. Childhood memories stayed packed away, but that was okay. Nostalgia could wait. The present demanded attention, and I was finally listening. By evening, I sat on the edge of the mattress with a cup of tea, staring at the tiny apartment walls that no longer carried expectations, judgments, or conditional approval. The quiet was profound, and it felt like the first time I had ever truly heard myself in months. I whispered softly to the empty room, "I'm okay. I can do this." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Of course, the reality of independence hit quickly. Bills, groceries, and the little errands that I had never handled alone before now demanded attention. But instead of stress, it felt empowering. Every small victory, paying rent, figuring out the Wi-Fi, organizing the kitchen, was a reminder that I could stand on my own. And in a strange way, I began to notice a shift that was already happening back at my parents' house. My phone buzzed one afternoon. It was my mom. "Did you take the folder with the insurance papers?" she asked, frustration edging her voice. I answered quickly, "It's in the blue drawer, bottom shelf." She paused, then a quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgement. "Oh!" That small exchange hit me harder than I expected. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were noticing what I did. My presence had always been a kind of utility in their lives. The one who remembered, who fixed, who quietly smoothed over small issues. And now that I wasn't there, suddenly they noticed. Not my absence, but the absence of my contributions. A week later, another message from my dad about the Wi-Fi router. Then a question about a utility bill he didn't understand. I responded politely, clearly, without any emotional attachment. Each message was a quiet affirmation that I could handle things on my own, and that they would need to adjust. Life in my studio wasn't perfect. There were days when the walls felt too bare, when the street was too quiet, when I missed the familiarity of my old home. But those moments were fleeting, replaced by a profound sense of freedom. I could breathe here. I could think. I could exist without constantly calculating my worth in the eyes of others. And slowly, the relief deepened into something stronger. Joy. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, resilient joy. I realized that my parents hadn't pushed me into independence. They had pushed me into freedom. And I had discovered that freedom was far more powerful than anything they could have offered me with their so-called generosity. Weeks passed, and life settled into a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd been craving. The tiny studio felt like home with every passing day. Morning sunlight spilling across the floor, the hum of distant traffic, the smell of coffee brewing. It was ordinary, yet extraordinary. Ordinary because it was simple. Extraordinary because it was mine. Not borrowed, not conditional, not attached to anyone's approval. I started noticing things I'd never truly appreciated before. The quiet moments, the ability to decide when to cook, when to rest, when to just sit and breathe. There were no expectations lurking in corners, no silent judgments waiting behind my actions. I could read a book, rearrange my furniture, or even sing badly without anyone rolling their eyes. It was freedom I didn't even know I needed. But the world outside my walls still reminded me of the life I had left behind. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from my sister. "Mom and Dad keep talking about you. They say you've changed, distant." I stared at the screen, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Distant. I was distant from their control, their demands, their conditional love. And yes, I had changed. Not because I left, but because I had finally chosen myself. A small part of me expected guilt, maybe an ache for missing family dinners. But what I felt was clarity. Life outside had given me perspective. I could see how much energy I had wasted trying to fit into their expectations. Every compromise, every yes I had whispered to them, had cost me a little piece of myself. Now, those pieces were returning, stitched together by independence and quiet self-respect. Then came the first real test of their absence. My dad called one evening, not an angry or demanding call, but a practical one. "Where's the spare set of keys for the mailbox?" he asked. I explained calmly. No lecture, no resentment, just clear, concise directions. My mom followed up later with questions about household documents and the cable bill. Each interaction was brief, functional, almost as if I had become a consultant rather than a daughter. It was a strange realization. They didn't miss me. They missed what I had done for them. The quiet fixes, the reminders, the invisible labor that had smoothed over the rough edges of family life. And that knowledge stung more than anger ever would. Not because I felt rejected, but because it highlighted exactly what they had valued about me. And it wasn't me. It was my utility. I spent evenings rearranging my studio, each act of decorating a rebellion against the idea that I needed permission to exist. I strung lights across the window, stacked my books by color, and even hung a small tapestry on the wall. It was silly, perhaps, but each little detail screamed autonomy. I was shaping a space that reflected me, not the compromises of a life built to fit into someone else's mold. Friends began to notice the change too. Late-night calls, random texts, check-ins. They didn't comment on the small apartment or the modest furniture. They noticed me. The laughter that came more easily, the confidence that had been buried under years of obligation, the spark in my eyes that had been dulled. It was subtle, but it was real. Then came a rare Sunday afternoon, and I decided to walk past my old neighborhood. I drove slowly, letting my eyes take in the familiar streets, the small park where I'd played as a child, the houses that had felt like boundaries more than homes. And when I finally passed my parents' house, I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel longing. I didn't feel the urge to turn back. There was only a sense of quiet gratitude for the clarity, for the independence, and for the chance to finally exist on my own terms. That night, I received another message from my mom. "The house feels different," she wrote. Short, clipped, but there was something in it. A recognition, perhaps, or maybe a hint of discomfort. I smiled to myself and typed back simply, "Yeah, it does." No excuses, no justifications. Just acknowledgement that my life had shifted and I had to adjust to it. Life outside that house wasn't perfect. It wasn't always easy. Bills, errands, responsibilities, they piled up in ways I hadn't experienced before. But they were mine to manage. Every challenge faced and solved built a confidence I hadn't realized I was capable of carrying. Every small victory reinforced the truth I had discovered at the dinner table weeks ago. My worth wasn't measured by compliance, approval, or tolerance. It was measured by my ability to stand alone and thrive. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when my phone rang. My dad's name flashed on the screen. I paused, feeling the familiar flutter of tension in my chest, but I didn't hesitate. I picked up. "Hey," he said, his voice different this time, less firm, less commanding, almost hesitant. "Hi," I replied calmly. There was a pause long enough for me to notice that the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't calling to dictate, to instruct, or to issue ultimatums. He was calling because something had unsettled him. "Your mom, she's been upset," he began. "She thinks maybe we were too harsh." I let the words hang between us. Too harsh. A rare admission, though still not an apology. "Maybe," I said quietly, "or maybe it's the first time you realized I didn't need to fit into your expectations." He cleared his throat. "Don't you want to talk about it?" I smiled, softly, though he couldn't see it. "I do," I said, "but not the way you think. I've built a life where I don't feel like I'm asking permission to exist. I'm not giving that up." Silence stretched across the line. I imagined him absorbing what I had said, processing the truth that I had finally chosen myself over compliance. Finally, he said, "I hope you're happy." "I am," I replied firmly, meaning every word. After that call, the subtle changes became more apparent. They stopped offering the guest room, stopped making quiet demands disguised as generosity. And the best part? They began to speak to me differently, not out of fear, not out of manipulation, but with acknowledgement that I had agency, that I could leave and stay gone without them controlling the narrative. Weeks later, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment. My friends came, bringing laughter, warmth, and normalcy. We talked about work, life, silly anecdotes, dreams. There were no tensions, no judgments, no comparisons. Just me, fully present, fully accepted by the people I had chosen around me. And in that space, I realized something profound. This was life lived on my terms. Life without conditional approval, without guilt, without compromise. Then my sister called. She was hesitant at first, unsure how to start. "They've been saying you've changed." "Distant," she said, almost as if testing the waters. I laughed quietly. "I am distant," I admitted. "Distance changes things." She chuckled awkwardly, but I could hear curiosity beneath her tone. "You'll get over it," she teased. "No," I said softly. "I got through it." I could hear the realization dawning on her, that the distance wasn't about anger, resentment, or drama. It was about boundaries, about self-respect, about finally existing without being conditioned by others' expectations. Life in my little apartment became richer, fuller, and quieter in ways I hadn't anticipated. I developed routines, small rituals that anchored me. Morning coffee while watching the sunrise, journaling in the evenings, occasional phone calls to friends and colleagues. Each action reinforced my autonomy, reminding me that my life didn't depend on validation from a family that had only ever measured my worth through obedience and compliance. Months passed. The small cracks in my parents' armor began to show in subtle ways. My mom started asking me for advice on household things, not as a command, not as a rebuke, but because she genuinely needed guidance. My dad texted questions about the streaming account, the Wi-Fi router, the bills. And every time I answered calmly, politely, efficiently, not to please them, not to earn affection, but simply because I could, and I wanted to maintain respect without sacrificing my autonomy. It struck me one evening, sitting on my couch with a cup of tea, that the life I had feared was terrifying was actually the life I needed all along. Freedom wasn't just about being away from them. It was about reclaiming my self-worth, my confidence, and my right to exist on my own terms. And in that moment, I understood the bravest thing I had ever done wasn't leaving. It wasn't even surviving their indifference. It was choosing myself over the role they had cast me in. The final piece came unexpectedly. One Sunday, my mom called. Her voice was softer this time, tinged with uncertainty. "You could come over for dinner sometime. Use your old room." I smiled quietly with no guilt. "My old room," I corrected gently. "Not your room. Not your home. Mine." There was a pause, and then something I hadn't expected. Understanding. Not apology, not praise, just recognition that I had grown, that the balance had shifted, that the person they had underestimated now stood firmly on her own. I replied simply, "I'm busy." And for once, it wasn't a lie. I had built a life filled with friends who valued me, work that respected me, and a space that was entirely mine. No compromises, no conditions, just living and living freely. Months had passed since I first stepped out of my parents' house, but the memory of that night, the night of the ultimatum, remained vivid. I could still hear my dad's voice, flat and casual. "You can take the guest room or move out." The words had stung then, sharp and final, but now, when I remembered them, they didn't feel like chains. They felt like the push I had needed, a catalyst I hadn't known I was waiting for. Life in my studio had taken on a rhythm I loved. I woke with the sun, made coffee in my tiny kitchen, and let the morning light spill across my floor. I didn't have all the comforts of my old room. No familiar posters, no childhood trophies. But what I had was far more valuable. Space to breathe, to think, to exist on my own terms. Each day, the walls I had once feared now felt like witnesses to my growth. They absorbed my laughter, my small victories, my quiet triumphs, and never judged me. Friends became my anchor in ways I hadn't expected. They noticed when I laughed more easily, when I spoke with confidence, when I made decisions without hesitation. I no longer felt invisible or burdensome. My relationships were chosen, not assigned. And slowly I realized that the life I had once considered temporary, back in my parents' home, was the life I had always deserved. Then the small shifts at home became undeniable. My mom called occasionally, a little less sharp in tone, a little more curious. "Did you take the folder with the insurance papers?" she asked one evening, a thread of frustration still in her voice, but beneath it, a quiet acknowledgement that I wasn't just a helper. They needed my input, even from afar. Dad, too, reached out with questions. Not complaints, not expectations, just genuine curiosity about how I handled things. And each time, I answered calmly, politely, with the quiet knowledge that I could help without compromising myself. The dynamic had shifted. I wasn't under their control. I was respected, and it was the respect that had always been missing, more than the comfort, more than the room, more than any favor. Occasionally I thought about my sister. She called one afternoon, hesitant, unsure how to approach me. "Mom and Dad say you've changed," she said. "They say you're distant." I smiled softly. "I am distant," I admitted. "Distance changes things." There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. "You'll get over it," she said lightly. "No," I replied. "I got through it." And in that simple exchange, I realized the final truth. The distance wasn't about anger, resentment, or punishment. It was about boundaries, about claiming my life, my choices, and my space. I had learned that independence wasn't cruel, it was liberating. Even the physical spaces I had left behind began to take on new meaning. Passing my parents' house in the car one evening, I felt no longing, no urge to return. The home that had once defined me now existed only in memory. I didn't need it to validate me anymore. I had my own life, and it was enough. By the time another family dinner invitation came, I knew I could attend on my terms. not to appease them, not to reclaim approval, but to engage as an equal with boundaries intact. And when I did attend, I noticed the subtle differences. My parents spoke to me without control, without passive judgments, and for the first time, I understood that they had learned, albeit slowly, that I was no longer a child to be managed. I thought about the guest room often, the space they had offered with a side of dismissal, a room that symbolized being tolerated. I never needed it. It had been a test I hadn't realized I was ready for. And when I walked away from it, when I chose myself over compromise, I discovered a life I had never imagined. A life free from conditional love, free from expectation, free to grow, to falter, to succeed, entirely on my own terms. Sitting on my couch one evening, I realized that the bravest thing I had ever done wasn't confronting them, or shouting, or demanding respect. It was walking away quietly, decisively, and building a life where my existence wasn't contingent on anyone else's approval. That night, I poured myself a cup of tea, watched the sunset spill across my floor, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known I could feel. And I understood, finally, that freedom, true freedom, isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's measured in the quiet choices we make for ourselves, in the decision to step out of spaces that diminish us, and in the courage to stand fully, unapologetically in our own life. I sipped my tea and smiled because I knew the truth. They hadn't pushed me into independence. They had pushed me into freedom, and I had claimed it